All right. So today I'm going to be talking about two different studies, just kind of giving you a little bit of the findings from both of these. They're kind of sequential. So the one I'll talk about first happened first, and then the second one happened after that. They're related, although they're on different assessments. They both draw on work that I did with WIDA at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They focus on kindergarten writing specifically. And yeah, I'll take a look at two of them. The first one is really research into the product of student writing, and the second study is really looking at the process. So that's kind of the overview of what I'll talk about. And so just to set context, because I saw in the chat that there are, folks joining from all over the world, so not necessarily familiar with the U.S. context. So first of all, the context of the study was through WIDA, which is a consortium made up of 42 different states that come together, and WIDA develops standards for English language and Spanish language, K-12 learning, and then also assessments, just research and professional development, those sorts of things. But really the focus of this talk will be on the assessments that are used for kindergartners in those 42 states. And then also in the US, I think the most recent stats I was able to find, about 15% of all entering primary schools, or kindergarten in the US, about 15% of those students are identified as English learners. Students who are entering schools and identified as potential English learners, usually this happens through a screening process. When you enroll your child in school, there's a questionnaire, and usually a screener is triggered by the fact that the child speaks a language other than English at home. And during that screening process, writing may be assessed. It isn't always, and in the few, maybe less than a handful of states, it is. So it may be assessed depending on where the child is. Students who are classified as English learners, then according to federal legislation, have to take an annual assessment of their English language proficiency, and in that assessment, writing must be assessed according to the federal legislation. WIDA has standards-based assessments, and in the latest version, the 2020 edition, that includes viewing and representing, which adds some important dimensions and also some interesting complications when we're thinking about assessment, when we're trying to conceptualize what that might mean for those two things. So just to kind of give a little bit of sort of theoretical grounding and a little bit of a literature review here, I want to talk about multimodality in young learner writing to help understand what I was trying to look at in this study. So I'm using a social semiotic perspective of multimodality. So that describes really the key thing is modes, multimodal. So modes here are semiotic resources that are used and shared. They have to be culturally understood, importantly to be shared. They include things like gaze, gestures, posture, in writing and speech, and we can break down speech even further into things like pitch and intonation and volume and silence even. So these are the different modes. So anytime we're communicating, we're not only using language, but I can't see my video right now. You can probably see my hands moving. There's gaze involved. There's a whole lot of things happening when we're trying to communicate meaning. And I'll talk in this study about what that means for writing in particular. Another key concept is the idea of ensembles. So anytime we're communicating, we're using these multiple different modes, and they're working together in ensembles. So the act of communication is essentially a multimodal ensemble, where all of these different modes that we're using are doing different communicative work. So written language is just one of several modes and ensembles, and the examples I'm going to show you are really going to focus on how drawing and writing work together as ensembles. So in particular with writing, one of the things that we can look at is layout, so how different elements are arranged or fixed on the page. We can look at salience, so who or what is either kind of in the center or larger, what occupies the most space. We can also look at cohesion, so specifically here with writing and drawing, Martinick and Selway kind of defined 3 different ways that these can be cohesive. So there can be elaboration with either the writing or the drawing sort of restating or clarifying. I think a simple example of this is like when children are drawing a picture of something and labeling it. There's also extension where either the picture or the writing adds information, or there can be enhancement, where one of those modes is providing information about how, when, why, in relation to the clause. So thinking about these really, the drawing and the writing as clauses. And they were looking at textbooks, professionally adult done things. So you'll see how I adapt these ideas a little bit when we're talking about kids writing and work. I think it's important to keep in mind that this isn't necessarily a new thing. For example, when we think about layout, this is something that's kind of been hidden, not really hidden, but just not used. The same terminology hasn't been used in the past. So just to take one example of how a writing progression is stated for monolingual writers most often, or assumed monolingual. There are things like the child can compose with linearity. So again, that's thinking about the layout. That's a layout feature. They can compose with directionality. Again, directionality is part of the layout. And then using the spacing between words. So all 3 of those are really about the layout of the writing. So that's part of the multimodal aspect of writing. In assessments specifically, there have been a lot of studies of developing writing. There's been a lot of work on emergent literacy skills.
The digital world,
a lot of it conducted with monolingual speakers.
Is moving fast. For today's students, that means new opportunities and new challenges we never imagined. But kids and teens shouldn't have to face this moment alone. Introducing the Digital Literacy and Wellbeing Curriculum from Common Sense Media. It includes expanded topics like AI, design tricks and influencer culture, flexible lessons with fun, play-based activities, and a human-centered approach with kids' mental health in mind. Plus, support for schools and interactive family activities and resources. The curriculum is created for and by teachers, research-backed and 100% free for educators everywhere. Their world is digital, their well-being is human. You can give them the skills and mindsets they need to thrive.
And sound letter correspondence, things like the word boundaries or word spacing, punctuation, capitalization, those other kinds of conventions. So that's been the sort of preoccupation of many studies in the past. With young learners, there are a lot of special considerations when we're thinking about assessment. Maybe in particular, the type of assessments that I'll be talking about here, which are sort of these large-scale, standardized, and fairly high stakes assessments. Um, when we're doing research, I think it's important to keep in mind that our conceptions, as Anna Maria Pinter said, our conceptions of the child influence our approaches to research. So it influences how much or to what extent we're able to hear and work with children in this. Working with young learners in assessment presents unique challenges. I'll talk more about this in the next study, but affect is very important. It's highly visible. I'm sure a lot of you, maybe all of you, have worked with young children, and you know that their feelings and emotions are very visible and important to work with in teaching and assessment. Generally, we know that negative affective responses can negatively impact test scores. A lot of this, as we'll talk about, has been focused on test anxiety and how that negatively impacts performance. A lot of this mostly with older students again. And when we're thinking about kindergarten, tasks have to be both linguistically and age or developmentally appropriate. So things like task familiarity really matters a lot. Instructions being very simple, that matters a lot as well. So those things that we need to keep in mind. So the first study that I'll get into here is looking at the multimodal features of immersion writers. So the purpose of this study was really to get some more insight into how kindergarten multilingual learners were writing in English, and to better understand how they were using multiple modes in their writing to convey meaning, and to inform language assessment and pedagogy practices. So the research questions were really, how are multimodal features used to make meaning in English language writing by these multilingual learners? And then how do the features of their writing differ between low, mid, and high level English language proficiency multilingual kindergartners? So the assessment that we were looking at in this study was the WIDA screener for kindergarten. This is a pencil and paper test. It's one-on-one administration. It has a responsive test design in that there are stopping rules if a student sort of hits their ceiling or the limits. There are rules for stopping the test in each domain. It can be administered either as a 2 or a 4 domain test. Like I said, just a few states require incoming kindergartners to do the 4 domain test, so they, in those cases, would be doing reading and writing as well, entering kindergarten. Most of the states, though, just do the listening and speaking test for incoming kindergartners. They may administer the 4 domain test if a student is coming in later in the year, or in some cases, schools will use this to screen students before first grade. And in that case, it would be all 4. For this study, we were looking at the field test. So they did take all 4 of these. And specifically with the writing tasks, there are several different writing tasks. In the study, we only looked at the name writing task, and then, which is the first one. They start with name writing. And then they do a narrative writing task, which is open-ended. It's a narrative retell of a story that the students have just been read. And there's visual support from a series of images. And when they are doing this writing, they just have a blank page in front of them. There was no line writing pages for them. So the participants in this, like I said, this was during the field test, so this was administered in 2 phases in 2019 and 2020. We got about 1,600 students from across 25 states and territories, 69 different home languages, about half male, female. So it was a pretty big study. For this specific study, we took a subset of 300 students' responses to that name writing task and the narrative writing task. And we took 100 samples from sort of a random selection from students who scored as low proficiency with a raw score of either 1 or 2 on their narrative, mid-level proficiency, or high proficiency. So we had equal numbers in each group. I'm just going to talk today about the multimodal features that we looked at. But you can see here we coded for a lot of different features across all of these writing samples. And specifically, just to kind of make a shorter story, the layout, there wasn't really any discernible patterns that we saw. 99% of the students wrote from right to left, as you would expect, although there were a few that wrote diagonally, and up and down. So that did happen occasionally. There were patterns in, students writing like 1 word per line versus doing text wrapping, with lower proficiency students having that more list-like writing. But I want to focus on what we saw in the drawings here. So with the drawings, we found that about 30% of all of the responses contain drawings, and the students were not prompted to draw, but the test administrators also were instructed to let them. If a student started drawing, you're not supposed to stop them, but just kind of let them and encourage them to write as well, but to not really interrupt that drawing process, even though it was unprompted. So that's what kind of sparked our curiosity to see this in so many of the samples, to have students just sort of unprompted doing drawings. We wanted to understand what was happening. In these, when we looked at them closely, we could recognize what the students were drawing about 23% of the time. So not all of the drawings included something that we actually knew what the child was trying to draw. So that was excluded for the most part. For the content, students were drawing characters, setting, action, the problem or solution, sort of the plot. So here we see the story that they're retelling is about Elephant and Hippo. Elephant is looking for his friend Hippo. You can see the writing. He first looked at the grass, but he was not there, but he was not here. So we see the grass up here, an elephant looking, and then the tree, an elephant looking there, and elephant looking behind the rock, and there's Hippo, and then they run off to play. So in the content, I think the thing that really stood out, and these are just descriptive statistics because there weren't enough to do sort of more detailed analyses here. So this is a fairly exploratory study, but we can see that there were a little bit more prevalence of depictions of action or problem and solution with the lower proficiency students than there were in the higher proficiency group. But again, not enough to really see strong patterns. When we're looking at salience, so again, what's more prominent on the page, what's more central, we see like this one here, the same drawing again. We can see that the drawing is much more salient than the text. The text sort of blends in almost with the drawing. So you see the grass up here. It almost sort of looks like another depiction of grass in a way. But the drawing is doing much more work to convey meaning. Here's the opposite example where there's just a small image of elephant at the bottom, and the text is carrying most of the meaning here. So Hippo wasn't anywhere, elephant was finding Hippo, but I couldn't find him in the tree. I was founding on the rock and I found him, me and Hippo go to the pond. So this is the transcriptions are taken from the students themselves are reading back what they've written. And there were examples of salients where it was roughly equal. So we see here sun, flower with the R for flower and a T, tree, rock. So we see a little bit of sound letter correspondence beginning, but again, the size and salience is roughly equal for the drawings and the writing. So when we're looking across proficiency levels, we notice that for the lower proficiency students, it seemed to be happening more often, at least than in the higher proficiency group, that the drawing was either more salient or equal salient. So more salient in almost 30% of the lower level group, and roughly equal at about 22%. So it was very less likely that text was going to be more salient with the lower proficiency students. When we look at cohesion, we ended up classifying 3 types of cohesion. The first was just thematic, which is that the drawings were about the story. So they included, the characters or something from the setting. So that's the first kind of type of cohesion that we were finding. And this was very prevalent. Most of the kids drew pictures relevant to the story that they were writing about. Occasionally a student would draw something completely random or something that we couldn't tell what it was, but these were only coded based on when we could recognize the drawing. There was also reference or elaboration. So what Martin and Consalway called elaboration, we called reference because it's sort of that labeling. In most cases, it was like we saw in the previous example here with rock, a rock being called rock, or more often elephant being labeled with an E, or hippo being labeled with an H. This one was a little bit of an outlier because the hippo, the student renamed the hippo Gonza and wrote that, and then wrote fruit to indicate that it's a fruit tree. So there were very rare times when it was a little bit more of what Martin and Consalway called elaboration. Most often we just called it a reference cohesion. And then extension did happen as well. So here we have an example of elephant was finding hippo, elephant and hippo went to the river. And so we see that the picture actually adds some of the context for elephant finding hippo behind the rock, which is not in the writing. So that's one example of how extension cohesion happened as well. So here, the thing that I really want to draw attention to maybe is just this reference cohesion. That type of cohesion where they're sort of labeling pictures happened much more often with lower proficiency students, and we didn't see it at all with the high proficiency students. Although you can see there were very few students from the high proficiency group who did drawings. So just kind of a quick discussion, implications, and again, exploratory study, but looking at their features, we did see that drawings convey meaning, which is very important to acknowledge, especially maybe in an assessment context. Drawings may be more or less salient than the writing, and they do add cohesion with the written stories. I think that's another really important point. They may represent parts of the story that aren't actually written. How we saw them being used at these different proficiency levels were, there was more variation in the content of the drawings at the lower proficiency levels. So it seemed as though the lower proficiency students who may have had less English to use to convey what they wanted to convey were using drawings to convey meaning more. this is seen through the salience of the drawings being more prominent at the lower levels, lower proficiency levels, and then also cohesion. That is something that we noticed became more sophisticated, perhaps, or more varied once we looked at the mid and higher proficiency level groups. So that may be something then that instructionally can be focused on. As far as sort of tests and pedagogy, I think this can inform task development. So there's some support for explicitly multimodal tasks for kindergarten. So actually asking them to draw before they write, which is very common pedagogically. And then just recognizing that the drawings convey meaning and contribute to cohesion. As far as rubric development, I didn't really talk about this much, but we ended up after this study, because the findings on some of the mechanical features that we saw were fairly salient. Not to use that word in a different way, but they just weren't meaningful in how kindergartners were writing and conveying meaning. So things like word boundaries, letter formation, capitalization, punctuation were all, there were just no clear patterns for any of these things. And about half the kids used word boundaries consistently, and it didn't matter what their proficiency level was. Maybe 6 out of 100 used capitalization consistently, again, across about the same level across. So these types of things just weren't very meaningful. And I think this contributes to an asset-based view of learners. So, understanding their multimodal communication helps us really focus on what they can do in their writing and support them in that way. Just a quick acknowledgement to my collaborators on this. These were sort of the key collaborators, although there were a lot of people that were working on data collection and things with this study. And with this one, this did just come out last May, March online. I think May is the official date, but it's in the Early Childhood Education Journal. So I think maybe I can pause for a moment if there are any questions on that study before I move on to the second one here. Yeah, I see one hand.
Hi Gordon, this is Yuko Butler. I'm sorry my video is not working, but I truly enjoyed your talk. It was fascinating, really excited to hear more about it. But I have a quick question. How did you classify the students into 3 proficiency levels in the first place?
We were using the scoring rubric for the assessment, and we just, for this study, we used the raw scores for their narrative writing. Because this was from the field test, the rubric was also being field tested with this. So that was really the sort of rough way that we broke it down. We took students who had either a 1 or 2 raw score for the low proficiency, 3 or 4 for mid, and then 5 and 6 for the high proficiency groups. And the rubrics are now, the rubrics that we use to do this are available online at WIDA's website too.
Thank you.
Yep.
And Gordon, there's a question from James, or a comment from James in the chat. If you don't have access to it, I can read it aloud for you.
I can see it. I have to turn because it's on my other monitor.
Okay.
See it now. I just saw it. So when we're looking at action, outcome, words, attempts, that sort of thing, that was not in the rubrics. And in fact, the drawings were not used in any way as part of the assessment. They weren't measured or scored in any way. So it was only the writing that was scored. I think that's one of the challenges that this brings up that I plan to talk about at the end, is that, there isn't really a clear way forward yet for how to deal with the drawings and how we might incorporate or operationalize those. So I hope that kind of answers that question. The kids in this study, because we weren't looking for it specifically until after we got their responses and noticed that it was so prevalent. So the kids did talk to their teachers who were the test administrators, but we didn't gather that data actively during this. So that's why this is a little bit limited here. Okay. Well, maybe I can move on with the next study here. So this study was kind of follow-up in a way. In this study, we were looking at the We to Act test for kindergarten. So the first study was the screener that the students take to determine if they are in need of English language support or not. This is the sort of summative assessment then. Again, it's one-on-one. It's administered to over 250,000 students per year between December and March. And these scores sort of provide the baseline data for measuring language growth and informing in-school support for accountability measures as well. So that's where this study is coming from. In design, it is very similar to the screener assessment. So just to talk a little bit more about affect, I mentioned this in the first study, but a lot of the study on affect has been sort of as an individual's psychological function. So we go back to the affective filter, Krashen's affective filter. When you get nervous, you are less able to communicate. It's an individual, it can be dynamic and variable trait, but a trait is connected to cognition. A lot of the way that this has been studied in language assessment, again, has been about test anxiety, inhibiting cognitive processing. So we know that having a negative response or a lot of anxiety, you perform worse on a test. In this study, we are taking affect theory, which is more of a socioculturally situated and embodied view of affect. So in this, we're thinking of affect not only as sort of a me problem, like when I walk into a testing situation, if I feel nervous, it's not just about what's happening inside my mind and that's impacting me, but it's a sociocultural understanding of testing as being high stakes and something that induces anxiety in the first place. It's a way to talk about testing as a society, as being something like that, high stakes. It's embodied. You can feel when you have a lot of anxiety, you can feel it in your body. It changes how you act. It's also co-constructed. So you can imagine situations where you come in to a space and you're very anxious and the people around you can either improve that or make it much worse. And it also then it emerges intersubjectively between people and is materialized through multimodal discourse. So we see it happening. So the research question for this test was, how do test administrators work with students during these one-on-one writing tests to co-construct a positive affective experience for young learners? So this was during the cognitive labs for this assessment. And these happened in 5 different states with 8 different test administrators, 57 students, and 2 different writing testlets. The data collection looked like this. We had their response booklets, score sheets, video, and then audio recorded interviews with the students and the test administrators. So in the room when we were doing this, we had both researchers, one seated, the person who was doing the interview was seated at the table so that they're kind of part of this experience. We had an audio recorder, a little GoPro camera, and then another camera looking down over their shoulder at the writing, and then somebody else in the room, not hiding from the student, but kind of in view. We found that made the students more comfortable. So I'm just going to show you one example from this. One test administrator, Ms. Rizzo, and Sophia. She's in 1st grade because this was happening in October, so it's the beginning of the year. So we did the writing testlets with grade 1 at the beginning of the year, just to give us a better proxy and more information than you would probably get from kindergartners at that point in the school year, which would only be their not quite even their 2nd month in school yet, just over a month in. So the test experience for this COG lab went like starting with a storybook reading, which set the theme. Then there was a name writing task, shared writing where it's the teacher writes one word, the student writes one word, and then phrase writing where the student is writing a short phrase. And then W3 is connected writing, which we'll look at here. And then it ended with sort of open-ended extended writing, like we saw in the narratives in the last study. So we used multimodal interaction analysis for this. There were 3 of us that were working, actually 4. There was one early on who ended up leaving the project. But there were 3 of us kind of carrying out sustained work on this. And in the findings here, I'm going to talk about just one moment that sort of represented these dilemmas that happen quite often across administrations, where TAs had to figure out how to manage student affect. And most often this happened at W3, so students started to struggle at this mid-level connected writing experience. At this point, in the one that I'm going to talk about, Sophia has met all the expectations. She's been doing a great job on this. And Ms. Rizzo is using a variety of different strategies, embodied multimodal, to manage her affect. And again, this was happening in almost all of the administrations we observed in different ways. But there was always these dilemmas that came up, and the TAs were using different strategies to manage affect in those moments. So the dilemma here is that the script and response booklet give specific standardized supports and scaffolding. So importantly, this is a standardized assessment, so it's supposed to provide an equal experience to all students. So there are scripted, if necessary, questions to prompt further response from students. If their initial response didn't meet expectations, there were scripted follow-up questions to ask. The students had images to support them. In this particular task, there was model writing by the test administrator. There was also a sentence starter that had go. In this task, it is asking the student has to identify an animal and then what the animal eats and then where they go to eat. So we imagine them writing something like, go under the tree, eat the worm, in this case. Something like that. But there was a request for additional support that went beyond the script. So of course, the students did not really stick to the script. They often went off. And so we'll see how Ms. Rizzo responded to this request for additional help that would be on the standardized. Okay. So the response from Ms. Rizzo when Sophia asks for additional help is to say, can you look at what I wrote and use that to help you? the way that she's managing affect is happening through her body position, her facial expressions, her gaze, her tone of voice is kind of soft and encouraging. She's asking questions, and she's acknowledging, not just with a sort of acknowledgement of the student response to, if necessary, questions and for additional prompting. So here, see her body position, she's sort of oriented towards Sophia. Most of the time she's reaching across, so there's this sort of closeness that's built here between the two. And then, we see a lot of eye contact, and when Sophia's asking questions and asking for more help, there's a smile. So it's very warm, and it's maintaining that positive affect. So there are a range of ways that Miss Rizzo could have responded to this. She could have rejected the request. She could have said simply, "I can't tell you," which would have maintained the standardized aspect of this. She could have said something a little bit softer, but with the same effect of, just try your best. She could have provided more support than she did. She could have explained more in detail about, how to connect what the bird eats to where it eats. She didn't do that either. Instead, what she did was she directed the student to notice the existing supports, to look at the model writing, which, we felt was sort of in the middle here, maybe slightly more on the side of providing more support. But she was doing that in order to maintain that positive affect, because if she had rejected the request, and Miss Rizzo and other TAs were aware of this, it could have shut Sophia down, essentially. So I'll go a little bit faster here, but essentially affect matters a lot in language assessment for young learners because they don't understand the stakes of what's happening in kindergarten. They don't understand what it means to take a high stakes assessment, really. So their affective experience becomes very important, because if they don't like what they're doing, they're just not going to do as well. So I think this adds to that body of evidence. From a slightly different perspective in looking at it as being very socioculturally understood and embodied. As far as implications, I think, what we found was that the scaffolds matter a lot. Those are tied to affect. So if the students feel supported, if they feel like they can be successful, then they had a positive affect. The scripting matters a lot. We added in more flexibility to facilitate more natural interactions during the testing experience. Instead of having these TAs always say, good job, good job, good job, we opened it up to say, offer more praise and encouragement, and we saw TAs sort of free up with that. We also saw fairly often some translanguaging or use of the student's home language as an affective resource, not as additional support at any point for the test, like translating or anything, but maybe they're using their home language to tell them that they've done a good job or something like that. And we also developed videos to help the test administrators understand how to do this and how to provide that affective support. So again, just acknowledging the many collaborators on this. Jason and Vera are actively working on this with me still as co-authors on a piece. Shay was involved earlier on, and we had a huge team at WIDA and the Center for Applied Linguistics working on this. So I think kind of at the end of this, between both of these studies, it really surfaces some questions about what counts or what's measured in early literacy. Again, with that multimodality, that aspect of it, and with viewing and representing being part of the WIDA standards, but not only WIDA, I think more broadly across the world, even here in Singapore, viewing and representing are core parts of the English language curriculum. And I think that there's still a lot of struggle about how to operationalize these in assessment particularly, but even in teaching and sort of classroom assessment. So it also makes me think about what changes when we really focus on that interaction too. How are we understanding proficiency or test validity when we're thinking about either of those as an interactive process? So with that, we'll stop, open up for questions. I hope I haven't gone for too long.